First of all, I'd like to just say thank you, Ginny and Liesl, for agreeing to come on to the show to have this conversation today about systemic racism and how we can heal together. I'd like to just start, though, with a moment of silence. There's the protests around the country took quite a turn over the weekend. And in the midst of all that, the death toll from COVID-19 is just growing through the roof, just staggeringly. Numbers. So I'd like us to just take a moment of silence and be reflective about how these things intersect. So, Ginny and Liesl, you both have had an opportunity to kind of see some of the shows, some of the sessions that we've had, the conversations, and how they take their own twists and turns. Mm-hmm. What I'd like to do is start by having both of you share something about yourselves that you'd like someone else to know, you'd like other people to know, perhaps particularly someone who might assume just looking at you, they know who you are or they know what your life is. So I'd like to have you share something from a part of your life that goes beyond what you think people typically assume when they see you. And either of you can start.
Go ahead, Liesl. You know, and I hate to go back and say, you know, when this whole racism thing, you know, started, it didn't just start, you know, this has been going on. But, you know, after, you know, recently, I realized that I am uneducated in everything that's going on. And on one hand, though, my growing up, basically, yes, I'm white, and I was privileged in growing up in Ortega, but because of a really bad divorce and broken family, I actually had, and I always hesitated when I was younger to say a black godmother, and she had children and a family, so I had this black God family who took care of me and who loved me when my family didn't. And so the love I have, and again, I hate saying black because we're people. We're all people, you know. Why do we have to be black or white or, you know, I mean, we're God's children is what we are. And it hurts me so much that we're fighting against that. And I just want to do anything and everything I can to make it known that we're all God's children. We're all one people. The division hurts a lot because of who loved and raised me.
Did you live with them?
A bit, yeah. You know, when I was very young, my parents divorced right after I was 1 year old. And I don't want to say I was homeless, but it wasn't until I was in first grade that we had our own house. Mm-hmm. And I had my first bedroom. So, yes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And are you still in contact with
yes.
Your godmother?
Yeah. Again, when all this, you know, came about again, because it didn't just start, I called, you know, my family, who I feel more comfortable with, my colored family. You know, again, I feel like, you know, black, white, we're the color of love, right? So yeah, I called them, and I talked to them, and I feel more comfortable with, you know, the people who took care of me and loved me when my actual family didn't.
How painful that must have been.
What's that?
How painful that must have been.
Well, thank God for God and this place and people like you all, and
I have a very unusual background. I was raised by a single parent. My mother and father divorced when I was 6 months old. Matter of fact, I was born in Frankfurt, Germany, where my father was a pilot in the Berlin airlift. And mother brought me back to the United States alone. They separated, and she came to her mother, who was very indigent. And we lived for the first 10 years of my life on a flat, an upstairs flat that was given to us by my uncle who owned the house. And for the first 10 years of my life, my mother and I slept in the same bed together. My mother was a secretary. She rode the bus every day to work with a hat and gloves on. And she was devoted to me. I mean, just devoted to me. And she came from a blue-collar background. Neither her mother nor her father had a high school education. And she knew, and I don't know intrinsically how she knew this intrinsically, that an education was the way to middle class. So even though I was terrible in high school with grades, just terrible, my mother jokingly said that Ginny majored in boys and hairdos in high school. And every year I failed something and had to go to summer school, so I couldn't work in the summer. It was just pitiful. But finally, I got out of high school, and I left home very shortly thereafter. Within 24 months, I moved to Florida by myself in my car with all my possessions in my
And where were
backseat.
you living?
Syracuse, New York.
Syracuse.
That's where I grew up, in upstate New York. I forgot that part. So I moved to Florida, and I lied about my age. I got a job in a photography studio selling portraits and helping do the photography, portrait photography. And I started to go to college, and I was taking one course at a time. That's what I could afford. So eventually I got to the point where I said, this is going to take me to be an old lady before I finish this. So I started to go full-time, and I had full-time. I was at UCF, commuting from Daytona, where I lived, to UCF in Orlando, to put myself through college. So I worked at the JCPenney catalog department, taking and selling stuff. I worked selling cemetery plots door to door. I had an assortment of little jobs that would put gas in my car and get me to campus. So I have my undergraduate and my graduate degree, my bachelor's and my master's degree from UCF, and I'm the first college graduate in my family. So when I hear people struggling, I get the struggle. I get it. I really get it. There were times where I thought, this is crazy, I can't do this. And why am I so alone? There was no one to coach me to take the SAT, to fill out the application form, to apply for any kind of a grant or a loan. I borrowed most of the money. What I could pay on my own, I could, but the rest of it was all borrowed money. So it was years before I paid off my student loans, particularly since I had to have a master's degree to practice what I was majoring in. And when I hear people tell me that they don't feel accepted, they don't feel like they can get ahead, and all I can do is say, I raise my hand and say, I did it. You can. You can do this. It does help if you have somebody that guides you and mentors you, which I have done to hundreds of other women. But it is not impossible to do if you're all on your own. Now, I put this great distance between my mother and I, and we were estranged for almost 5 years. We didn't speak because of me relocating to Florida. But at that point, she was a young woman that was in her late 30s, early 40s, and she said, I can't move to Florida. I don't have any friends. I won't have a job. I don't know my way around. There were hurdles in front of her like this. But she had, for some unbeknownst reason to me, instilled in me this enormous sense of confidence, more than enough for one person. And I said, sheesh, I could do that. So I did. I put all my stuff in my little MG midget, and I drove. It took me 3 days to get to Florida. I was headed to Miami because I heard it was a big city. I got as far as Daytona, and I never left Daytona. So I have trouble with people who, I have to admit, who believe that they have to be given something, that they don't feel like they can do it on their own. I struggle with that. I greatly struggle with that. So I do not come from a privileged background whatsoever. What I have done and what I have earned has all been on my own, with help from people who love me and who guided me. But they are not part of my family, and I didn't take one dime of government subsidy. Zero, as my mother did. Zero. She was quite capable of being able to receive government welfare. She never took a dime. So there was a standard that was in our home that pervaded my life as I grew up into an adult. And the young women that I have mentored have what I consider to be a tad of what I intrinsically have in me, which is a great deal of self-guidance and a great deal of, I feel like I have power that can be used for the good of everybody. And as I have matured, I share that, is constantly sharing it. I've mentored multiple young women professionally, and my career path took a completely different turn, but I never was afraid of the opportunity that was presented to me. I went from being a speech pathologist, where I practiced for 7 years, moving to Jacksonville, running for public office, became a city councilwoman for 2 terms, then ran for the Florida Senate. So I've changed jobs. I've owned 7 different companies, all of them successful. And I'm now managing as the CEO and president of the Cathedral District JAX, which is a nonprofit redeveloping the 36 blocks all around this magnificent building. And that has been, without a doubt, the greatest challenge and the most fulfilling job I've ever had.
Well, Liesl, I think this is your mentor.
Yes, I know, this is perfect, yes.
I'm thinking,
Yeah.
the more I hear Ginny talk, I'm thinking, I've got the perfect mentee for you. So I think after this conversation,
Well, we'll get to know
you
each
need
other
Yeah.
better.
really look at how
Yeah.
you two can be supportive of each other,
Yeah.
actually.
Yeah.
I want to kind of go to a couple things that both of you have said. First, I'll start with you, Liesl. You mentioned that you were a bit embarrassed
Yes.
or uncomfortable with the fact that your godmother is African American. What was the embarrassment? What's the source of the embarrassment?
Basically, as growing up in Ortega, and all my friends, I remember being on the playground at school or something, and they were talking about their godparents. And I was just so embarrassed to say mine was black, because previously other conversations came up where, that would have been looked down upon. So I just kept my mouth shut.
How old were you?
This was like first grade, I was pretty little.
So as early as the first grade, you had a consciousness of a kind of ill feelings, inappropriateness to say that you were associated with African Americans.
Right. And I know, it sounds bad, but I just didn't want to be made fun of,
Yes.
And, when you were saying how people, have this sense of, not belonging, or it made me feel abnormal and like I didn't belong either. And, I still kind of feel that way in life. But then again, I know I do belong, and just like everyone belongs, and that's why I am fortunate to be in the position I'm at this church, to be able to empower others of, yes, we all do belong together. So, yeah.
So, going from that point, Ginny, what are your earliest experiences with African Americans?
That's a great question, because I've given this a great deal of thought.
Yeah.
I knew no one black,
Yeah.
zero. And I am of the product of the era where all across America, there was an occurrence that happened when the schools were integrated. It's called white flight.
Yes.
Happened in every city in America, so that the people with disposable income all left the downtowns and went to the burbs. My mother did that. She saved $500 and bought a little tiny tract house out in on the outskirts of Syracuse, in North Syracuse. I never met a black person in my school. I never spoke to a black person the entire time I was all in high school. By the time I got out of college, the first person I met, remember I was a speech pathologist,
Yes.
I was working at a school in Volusia County, and because the speech therapist is usually in a mobile trailer,
Yes.
half of my trailer was for me to do therapy with the kids, and the other half was a social worker who was assigned to the school. He was African American. When I opened the door between the two rooms, I said, "Holy cow, I want to shake your hand." I had never touched a black person,
Yes.
never. That was probably when I was late 20s. So it was a big revelation. We got to know each other and got to become great buddies. But after I left that and moved to Jacksonville, it was much the same. It was much the same. My neighborhood was all white. I had two homes. I actually had a condo and then a home, and then a big home on River Road in San Marco. No black people whatsoever, none. So when I became engaged with the chamber, and I had a management position at the chamber, I was the vice president for community development. That's how I changed careers. I started to become introduced to African Americans, but they were very seldom, if ever, in a leadership role. And the ones that came to Jacksonville in the corporate arena, who were in a leadership role, were just deluged with invitations to join this board and join that board and come and help me do this. And they were absolutely covered up with them because they were so rare. They were college educated. They were good in a successful business career. No women, almost all 100% men. And so that went for 5 years in that arena. So I had very little, really very little experience with the black life, the black experience. So I've read a great deal about it. And as I've aged, I've met some wonderful African American people. I now have 2 or 3 that I know intimately, that one that's on my board. And so we've had great conversations about this topic. But it's, for the most part, kind of like Liesl just felt uncomfortable, but she was disassociated from it. It just wasn't, it wasn't part of my world.
So are you of the view that there is such a thing as systemic racism? Because it doesn't sound like you have any experiences that would make you believe that that's something that exists.
Well, I've given it a lot of thought, and I watched a PBS documentary a couple of months ago that really contributed to that thought. And it talked about the history of voting in America and the history of selling real estate in America and how loans are made. And one of the hallmarks of moving yourself from or into a middle class is to own a home.
Yeah.
So when you make that move, it all depends on where you go to be a homeowner. And I have found, as an elected official, the people who vote are the ones that own a home because they pay taxes and who have children and are married. Those 3 aspects make somebody a regular voter. So the idea, the history of America has been to invisibly isolate people like this, isolate them, and to relegate them into certain classes. And I get that. I understand it completely. And I served on the city council with some wonderful black leaders. Warren Jones is one that I particularly really was very fond of. And Denise Lee was on the city council with me. Denise and I were always at loggerheads with each other, but afterwards we both mellowed substantially, and I would say I could call her my friend for sure. But I have not struggled like they have, and I didn't know that I was contributing in any way to their struggle. It just never occurred to me.
Yes.
And consequently, I led my own little life in my lily white world, living in a big house on River Road. But I had fought like a dog to
be
get
there.
there. So I didn't have a whole lot of sympathy with people who were saying, come help me, or give me more money to help me, because I had done it.
Do you think that that's what a lot of what you hear black people saying in the protests are suggesting? Help me, I'm a victim.
I
I've
do
been
think
taken
there's a victim
advantage of that."
mentality. Yes, I do.
That's
I
what
honestly do.
I heard. That's why I wanted to sharpen the focus of the conversation.
I did.
So you basically are saying that when you think about the protest or you hear and see the protest on television, that there's a great part of this to you that you hear of people saying, I'm a victim, help me, give me some more money, or something like that.
Not help me or give me more money, but definitely that I'm a victim.
I'm a victim.
And until you get that out of your head, that you're not a victim, you're always going to be under somebody else's direction like this. It's very dangerous to be perceived or just perceive yourself that way. I think it's very dangerous. Now, what I see happening in America today is a great support from the white community, particularly the millennials, towards the African American plight. And I think that we're in an opportunity right now where things are going to shift dramatically like this, so that the traditional role that I didn't experience because it wasn't around me will change dramatically. And I'm hoping that that will happen. I'm hoping.
Well, Liesl, what about you in your generation of this? What are your thoughts about the protest? And do you hear a lot of people saying or giving the impression that they're victims? What's your perception?
No. What I see out of the protest is that, no, they're not victims, and they're not wanting, what they want is this change. They want things to be set right, is what I see. They're not, necessarily calling themselves victims either. And if they are, again, they're trying to make this change, protesting against, so the future isn't felt victimized or felt living through all the division once again. Where I think, I haven't gone out there and protested physically out in the streets like that. There are other ways, and I've done that in a way. That's why I'm here right now. We're protesting for that change. We want, it has to happen, this change. The division, the brokenness, it has to end.
Well, let me ask you a question, if I can do that. In what context do you see change being made?
And again, it's going to have to start with each individual, with their own inner work, and God is going to have to be in the midst of that and everything. So, again, it's not an easy fix. It's not a quick, easy fix.
I had a great conversation with an African-American friend of mine who's a wonderful woman in this community and a great leader in this community. And we were in a friend's home where there were about 8 of us, having a glass of wine and discussing this dilemma. And we turned to her and we said, would you, I don't want to tell you who she is, would you be in charge? Would you take the responsibility of inviting some African-American leaders or friends of yours to come and talk with us about this topic? And she said no. And I said, why not? She said, this has got to be a white solution. The white people in America have got to look for the solution. I thought that was amazing. It was astounding. So what she said is that we've been fighting for years and years and years for this inequity to clear itself up, get better, and now it's up to you to do it. I thought that was profound. So I've given a lot of thought to that, and I'm not exactly sure how I can do that. I think being in this little dialogue with you guys helps. But it's a really interesting proposition, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, James Baldwin, a great African-American writer, said, it's easier to cry than to change. And I think that for a lot of people who feel they personally haven't done anything to contribute to the injustice, that it's difficult to emotionally connect with that kind of frustration, anger, and as we saw over the weekend, outbursts of violence.
Mm-hmm.
So the people who feel bad about it on a personal level will feel some kind of guilt maybe or cry a little bit, but they're not really being challenged to change anything. And so I like your question of asking Liesl, what would you want? What would you want change to look like?
Mm-hmm.
But I can be very concrete with you in terms of change and the kind of outcomes that I think are essential. One part of that is, yes, that whites have to look at themselves and examine their own motivations, their own habits, their own kind of social gatherings and businesses and all the things that make up your life needs to be reflected on differently, reflected on with maybe some new information that you've received.
Well, give me some specifics.
Well, I'll be really pointed,
Okay.
because this comes in two parts for me. This one part is for whites to be reflective. The second part for me is that blacks, we need to be deeply reflective. So when I say what are the outcomes, what are some outcomes, and Liesl, you hinted at the idea that we all need to do our work. When I say that blacks need to be reflective, I think that going to the heart of this ideal that you suggested of you feeling that there's a lot of blacks feeling like they're victims. What I will say is that there are historical factors that have created this sense of victimhood, like the kinds of black codes, Jim Crow laws, currently redlining, the kinds of policies that were implemented with the New Deal, which was supposed to be great for all Americans, but black Americans were redlined, and it was written and baked into the policies that were used to determine who would get funding, including African Americans who came back from World War II, who had fought for this country valiantly, bravely. There are historical reasons that there is anger and outrage at what has happened. But we don't stop there. My thinking is that as African Americans, the thing that we most need to do is assess how we're complicitous in the systemic racism that we're fighting to overcome. And what I mean by complicitous, I want African Americans to be as outraged over the killing, over the death of a young person that's at the hands of another African American as we are at the death of an African American from a police officer. I want it to be unacceptable. These are things that we personally as African Americans can begin to do to assess how are we contributing? How are we part of the problem? And what can we do differently? And I give the analogy that to a very great extent, African Americans have a role of an abused spouse in America. And what I mean by that is when I was growing up, I'm 61. When I was growing up, I never heard the word domestic abuse or domestic violence. That concept did not exist. However, women were abused In fact, it was so commonplace, it was so normalized, and I lived in a community as one of 3 African Americans. My community was predominantly white. White men abused their wives commonly. It was just men's authority, men's privilege over women. If a police officer came because a woman, a wife, a spouse called and she was being abused, when the police officer would show up, it was not uncommon for that police officer to say to the man, after the woman had called, if you can't keep that woman quiet, if you can't get control of her, we're going to come back and somebody's going to be arrested. So that abuse that was there didn't have a name for it as such, but now we're in an era where we know domestic violence exists, domestic abuse exists. And here's what we also know, that when that woman decides to stop it, to look that man in the eye and say, no more, this is over. I will no longer participate in this abuse. I will no longer give any part to it. The whole relationship changes. The entire dynamic of power shifts. So I agree with you that we are powerful, those of us who are historically on the side of injustice. We have power. We are more than victims. We're conquerors. And that's the message that I constantly give. However, that message is not at all to be looked at as a substitute for the real and concrete grievances of people who have historically suffered injustice. These two things have to be held in the same hand. They're not separate. It's not that we look at people and because you made it and you're successful and you're the first one in your family and you did it and you're still doing it, that's not the gold standard for someone else. Someone else, it has to be their life and their struggles and their experiences and what they have gone through. And that's something that we have to be able to hold together. We have to be able to say, yeah, there are people who were not as fortunate as I was. There are people who did not, for whatever reason, and many times it has to do with networks of support, many times, but they don't have the networks of support and access to other experiences.
You started down a road a little different before you got to the example.
Yes.
And you talked about black-on-black crime and the
Yes.
lack of outrage in the African-American community for black-on-black
The
crime.
lack of outrage particularly as it's portrayed in the media, because you've got all kinds of people organized on the streets in black communities, mothers and women and all kinds of activism going on in the African-American community to fight that. But the perception that comes across, and that's why I didn't get sharp in my focus, the perception that comes across is the perception that you raised, that here are people who are not outraged by the violence that's being perpetrated by people who look like them. They're victims, but they're victims of their own violence. If they're going to say that they're victims, I'm saying the logic of your statement about people in that environment is what I was really trying to unpack, to say there is evidence that these things happen, both of these things happen, and people are struggling to make the best of those difficult situations. Because they don't succeed doesn't mean they didn't desire to. Because they don't become the person who gets the high school diploma, then the college degree, and then an elected official, that doesn't mean they didn't desire it. It didn't mean that they didn't give everything that they could give to get to that other side. And I'm saying more directly and pointedly that there are groups of people in this country that historically have been denied the opportunities that you had.
I don't feel privileged at all.
I don't
Not
think
in
you should
the
feel
least.
privileged.
Not at all. And there are, from a philosophic perspective,
Yes.
there are 2 or 3 key factors that are universal,
Okay.
that can change your plight in life.
Okay.
2 or 3 key factors. They're pretty obvious in some instances. One is get at least a high school education, and more if you can. The other is try not to have children before you're married, because universally, if you look at the statistics of people who, like my mom, who had a child but was not married. She was married to my father, but I only met him once in my life. But we didn't have a man figure at all. She raised me as a single parent.
Jenny, first of all, you're speaking in a very narrow cultural context. You're talking in a cultural context that's almost completely European, and specifically, your ideal of the nuclear family is an ideal that's strongly challenged by other cultural frameworks. But so let me give you an example.
So I challenged it.
So,
I don't come from a nuclear traditional
I know
family.
you did, but you're saying don't have children. You're saying this standard, don't have children at a certain time. There are cultures where having children at a young age is the appropriate thing to do.
I'm talking about the United States. And what I'm saying, wait, let me finish my thought. So if you work on education,
Yes.
and you work on trying to advance yourself with the support of your family, if they can give it.
Yes.
If they can't, that's true. Then you
Yes.
find somebody else like you or like me
Yes.
who would help you in those things. And try very, very hard to move yourself from this level that you feel you've been held down to.
Yes. Yes.
Then I would say to you that without a doubt, those people who focus really hard on that and who have in the past focused hard on that they do take themselves out of poverty. I'm talking about a poverty scenario, not necessarily a black and white scenario, but
Yes.
a poverty scenario.
Yes.
And
Yes.
there is a big difference between the two.
Yes.
But I'm saying I was in a poverty scenario, and I rose with very hard work, got
Right.
myself out of the poverty scenario into just a middle-class American life.
Yes.
And once I got there, I ran into what you described as
Yes.
the American dream, the Leave It to Beaver story where you got a mom at home in heels and
Yes.
pearls making dinner. Well, that wasn't my life at all. But I was surrounded by that in San Marco and in Daytona to a certain extent, that seemed to be the norm. And it didn't occur to me that I couldn't get into that role. I couldn't get there
Yes.
if I wanted to.
If you wanted to.
That's the key. But we were talking
yes.
about something different,
Yes,
Khalil.
if you
we were
wanted
talking
to.
about outrage, about black on black crime.
Absolutely. I'm saying that these things are not contradictory, that they're not contradictory in the sense that we should look at them as mutually exclusive. I'm saying that we have to hold them in the same conversation. You have to be able to say to me as a white that you are not going to be stuck in political correctness because you're afraid that something you say to me is going to offend my sensibilities as a black person, particularly in this moment of a heightened awareness of systemic racism or racism and all those other kinds of things.
I don't have that fear.
Well, this is a good thing, but there are a lot of people who do, Jenny.
don't have
There are a
that
lot of
fear.
people who do. In fact, there are a lot of people who right now are saying that they feel uncomfortable having this conversation. That's why we're so happy that St. John's Cathedral said, yes, we will have the conversations. And that we can talk about it in a way. My goal is to take the political correctness lid off. We don't need it. We're adults. And particularly in a church community, we say that we come to the church community because we have some shared point of reference in our value or certainly in the way that we see ourselves. So that means for me, as you said, the love, Liesl, is the driving force for that connection. And if I love you as I love myself, then I need to have conversations with you like I'm having with myself in order for you to enter into a real relationship with me.
Churches are a funny example. Churches tend to be more neighborhood associated. What makes St. John's and all the other 5 churches that are in the Cathedral District so unique is that they remain downtown after everybody fled downtown. And in fact, if you look out at our congregation, it has this enormous diversity, which is incredibly attractive to a lot of people. That's why they come here.
Oh, this is an extremely
Very diverse, very diverse. You have African American, you've got gay, lesbian, you've got sitting next to a federal judge.
Yes.
I mean, it's very diverse. people will pass 3 or 4 other Episcopal churches
To come here for its diversity.
Right, for that very reason. So, but if you go back to the housing scenario again, most churches are in a neighborhood. The neighborhood tends to be the same because of the price of the home. So you end up in, if you look at closed neighborhoods like Marsh Landing or any of the suburban gated communities, what you have is, first of all, a litmus test to get in the gate.
Yes.
That you have to be able to
Yes.
be of certain wealth or you
Yes.
can't get in. So right there, you're an exclusionary factor. It's an exclusionary factor. So you end up with people who can afford a $500, $600, $700, or $1 million home. That tells you what kind of church they're going to also, because usually it's close by, and if you look at the population in that church, it's almost always reflective of the neighborhood. That's true in even closer in neighborhoods. If you look in Springfield, or if you look at Avondale and Riverside, or on the west side, or out at the beaches, people don't want to travel that far away, so the church reflects the neighborhood. So there's an interesting dynamic there that could be explored. If you put a couple of churches together that were completely isolated in their likeness, and another church over here that was completely different, and tried to join them like this periodically,
Yes.
learning from each
I
other.
believe the cathedral has done something like that. They've shared pastors
Yes.
We
had
have.
an interfaith.
I was going to say, that reminds me of, as a church leader, youth leader, in the past, I think it's our job to not stay at the church. We are to go out. And I've invited the kids at St. Mary's in the past to be a part of our youth group. And, you know, before COVID, my big plan was to invite all sorts of kids to all over Jacksonville to come here, because, I mean, we're not supposed to just stay here and just, you know, maintain the people here. We have a whole world out there, you know?
Exactly.
And I don't know, I kind of wanted to switch things up a bit. I know that's your job.
Yeah, no, I want you to go on. Listen, please.
You know, part of, to me, when I guess it comes to the whole systemic parts, a few weeks ago, I was watching something through, I guess, the Episcopal church, and they were talking about a big part of the problem is the way the prisons are. And it made me think that, yeah, why, you know, it brought me back again. I learn a lot when I look inward and think back to my childhood. And so I have 2 older brothers, and I remember watching Cops a lot, you know, right when it came out, like in the 80s, you know, early 90s, I can't remember. But, and of course they loved it, you know. But I remember watching it and again feeling so hurt, because I didn't see bad people getting arrested, you know. I saw people being torn away from their families and, you know, the kids left behind, and just people being, you know, handcuffed and treated like animals, and it hurt me. And it still hurts. And so, yeah, I don't know why we're still throwing people in cages. Why aren't we helping them? Why aren't we healing them? Just because somebody did something wrong, we're not supposed to just beat them and, you know, put them away somewhere. We should be helping them. And so...
Well, I think originally prisons were established to do just that, but we have come so far from that, so far. To go back to the church scenario, I think we have a wonderful opportunity as followers of Christ to bring other groups together to talk. Just like you said, go out. We could go out to them, or we can invite them in, to try and bring more what I consider to be rational thinking to the whole scenario, so that it's not you against me, or you against them, or them against each other.
Yes.
It is, in fact, a world that we all live in,
Yes.
and that we should attempt to try and live more lovingly, more equitably with each other, no matter what your race is. So that we have a challenge
Yes.
as Christians to do that. And it's important that we do it. Let me give you just an example of what we're doing here in the Cathedral District. We have 36 blocks of land and 118 acres in the Cathedral District. It's a big area.
Yes.
And when we hired an urban planning group to give us a master development plan of what should go where, what's the they call it the highest and best use for the property, they said, the first thing they said was 50% of the property is surface parking lots. And I said, oh man, that sounds like overwhelming. They said, this is a great opportunity. They saw it as an opportunity to assemble the land, and then what this district is missing is residential units.
Yes.
So that forces the question, well, what kind of residential units are we talking about? Other cities who have done this, urban renewal projects in a targeted area, have ended up with gentrification.
Yes.
Where you put these beautiful new residential units in place, and then the rents go up, 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 up. So the people who work in the area can't live where they work. So we have come, my board and I have had some discussions about this, and I have come to the conclusion that what you need is a mixed income, which is a throwback to how cities were
Yes.
platted and developed in the 40s, where you had apartment people living with single-family houses and then estate homes all together. Think Riverside, think Avondale, think San Marco, think Springfield. That's how they were platted. Then you had mixed incomes like this. So we're making an effort on the first project that we did. We bought a whole city block, and we sold it. And what will go on that block are about 200 apartments, and a portion of them are held out for reduced rent, called workforce housing. So there's no differentiation between your apartment and mine. If I'm paying less, if you're paying $1,000 a month and I only pay $600, you do not know that. They're just all the same. So that delta between what a developer would lose by discounting those apartments has to be free money that comes from the government. And there's a whole process in place to do that they apply for the money. It's very competitively sought after, and then you get the money to build the apartments. But I'm convinced that unless you move in that direction where you've got multiple income levels all working together so that you have a complexion, just like you see in this group right here within our congregation, that you won't be healthy, you won't be safe. It really kind of all works together. And as long as we have isolated communities that are all feeding each other with the same notion,
Yes.
they're not healthy.
Yes.
So we're doing our part in a very, very small way, like a fly speck in the city. We're doing our part
No,
in
I
the
think it's
Cathedral
quite
District
quite
to do
significant.
something about that.
Housing, you
It's-
cannot
it's
exist without
Housing.
housing.
Right.
So that's not a small contribution to make.
Well, our goal, we have 1,500 people that live here. Over 600 of them are seniors that are poor seniors living in the three towers. So we need, of the 1,500 people, we need about 3,000 people, quite a bit more, in order to make it a viable, financially viable community that can support a McDonald's or a grocery store or a five and dime. You have to have disposable income.
Yes.
So if you put many years ago, back in the 60s, and you put all poor people together in a HUD housing project like this, there was no retail around them because they didn't have the disposable income.
Yes.
So theoretically, and I'm hoping that I'll live long enough to see this come to fruition, theoretically, if we can do enough workforce housing mixed with market rate housing in this 36 block area, we will then have what I consider to be a healthy neighborhood. Somebody who gets up every day and says, do you know where I live? I live in the Cathedral District, and it's the coolest place in the city. So that is what we're trying to do in our small little way with the responsibility that has been given to us to try and change what you're talking about.
Yes. Well, I think it provides concrete, real opportunity for people
I do too.
to live together. And this goes to the heart of why I asked you from the beginning, when did you first meet African Americans in your life? Because it's almost impossible to know people without being, in fact, it is impossible to know people without being in a relationship with them. And relationships oftentimes don't happen because of the way we're segregated in our communities. So being intentional about building a community of mixed incomes and diversity is how you get it. You don't just hope,
It's
you don't have,
hard to do.
it's the work that you have to do.
It's really hard to
well,
do.
you know, I always say that one of the challenges with the church is a lot of people are praying for things that they can budget for. You know, it's like someone who comes to church, they've been going to church for the last 10 years praying for a new car. I just look at them and say, do you know that by the 10 years you've been praying, you could have budgeted and had 3 cars? So we're confused. A lot of this is stuff we're confused about. We have to take stock of what's really important. And that goes back to each of us doing the work that we can in the space that we occupy to make a difference. You're in a space that gives you access to do housing. Liesl, you work with young people, children, whose minds you're shaping, whose spirits you're nurturing. That is an immense responsibility. And it's one in which I think all of us need to be conscious and intentional about supporting you in that.
Yeah.
Because how those children are treated will to a great extent determine how they treat others.
Right. Yes.
With the case with you, Ginny, I'm very much like you. My story is very similar, except that I had actually quite a bit more privilege in my earlier years, but I had to get up and go make it happen. I couldn't allow the 20 years I spent in prison to be an excuse for failure. No one made me make the choices that I did that landed me in prison. I'm the first to say that I didn't make a mistake. I made a choice. I understood that the key for me was taking responsibility for the choices I made that landed me in prison. It wasn't systemic racism. It wasn't inequality. I was reckless. I was one of those kids that was simply reckless and made horrible choices. But I figured that out.
When did you come to that revelation? When you're there at the first 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years?
No, I came to that revelation after going to prison, getting out, and then being on my way back for what appeared to be the rest of my life. And I was clear that facing the rest of my life in prison, the only thing I can control in that whole scenario was how I would serve my time. Would I serve my time continuing to blame everyone else for me being there? Or would I serve my time in a way that I challenge myself to make the best use of it? I challenge myself to figure out, how did I really get there? Not just the fact of the arresting officer and the sentencing judge or the correctional staff. How did I get there? What is it that made me choose to engage in the kind of behavior that led to me being arrested in the face of a mother and a father who challenged me every day to be my best, parents who cared? I was fully aware that what I was doing was wrong, but I was angry and reckless. And I have to own that. So I'm not out here blaming the system as the reason for my incarceration. I do, at the same time, I do recognize that there are a great many people who are people who have suffered and didn't have the same opportunity that I had. They just didn't. And they didn't get the same, and even those who did don't have the same outcome. I don't necessarily think it's because I'm so great. What I do realize, though, is if I didn't put in the effort, it wouldn't have happened. If I didn't do the work, if I didn't decide to stop that kind of behavior, if I didn't take responsibility for how I got there, if I didn't decide to get an education while in prison, if I hadn't made all of those choices, the outcome that I now have would not have been possible. In fact, it would have been impossible.
All you said makes so much sense to me. It's so obvious that you have the ability to turn your life around. The part that is fuzzy is that when you try to talk to somebody who's 12 or 13 or 14 or maybe 16, then talk to somebody who's 30 or somebody who's 40, and the brain matures during that period of time, and then you say, what am I doing? What am I doing with my life? I want to make my life be as wonderful as it could possibly be and serve other people, or whatever your thing is, you know, make as much money as I can, or invent the greatest rocket that goes to the moon. And the time that you speak to somebody and the time that they come to that conclusion has a lot to do with your maturity.
Absolutely.
A lot to do with it.
Absolutely.
Remember I told you that I did terrible in high school? I graduated summa cum laude from college.
Yes.
And with my master's degree. And it was because I said, oh man, I want that so bad. And I was, at that point, in my early 20s, and I worked like a dog on it. I was like a dog on a bone. And nobody could deter me. So that happened to you, too.
Absolutely.
At some point in your life, you said, I am now mature enough to understand what I have done, and I shouldn't have done it, or I disagree with it now, and I made very, very childish decisions coming from loving parents.
Yes.
How terrible for you. I mean, how bad they must have felt. Where did they feel?
Without a doubt.
How did I fail him, you know?
My mother was so absolutely disheartened.
Yeah.
I remember when she came to me, she came to visit me. She said, you know, son, I'm not going to be able to visit you in prison. I will not visit you in prison. And I want you to know that I'm not going to visit you in prison because I cannot bear the thought that I would be looking at the child I brought into the world and gave everything that I have, that he would choose to take this path, the path that you have chosen. She said, because I want you to know you chose that path. I did not teach you that. You chose that.
Did you reconcile with her? Do you have a good relationship with her now?
I absolutely reconciled with my mother. My mother was my first teacher. I reconciled. I resented her at the time, as most teenagers, young people do. I couldn't see her wisdom. I didn't have access to her vision. I didn't understand her heart. And that she was really, in my case, she was heartbroken, is what it was.
Yeah, that'll kill you.
Yeah.
Did you feel that way with your parents? Did you feel disassociated from them, or did you say that, did your parents feel for some reason that they hadn't done something, or they had done something to you?
Well, my parents, you know, like I said, divorced when I was, right after I was 1 year old, maybe. And my mom hooked up with a guy who was really bad news. And so there was a lot of abuse all through my growing up until I was 13. He was finally out of the picture, but we were so estranged from my dad's side of the family that till this day it's still weird.
Were you still in Ortega?
At that point, yeah, but we were, and that's what's funny too. Yeah, we were in Ortega, but we were incredibly poor. We didn't have any money, and so it was interesting to live.
Have you reconciled with your parents?
Well, my mom passed away in 2007, and yes, I never had to reconcile with her. She's great. She is what made me here and why I am here in this place. Yeah, because my dad's Jewish, and I have 3 other siblings, and we came from a large, broken family, but she was the one who pushed her children to go to an Episcopal church. You know, we were all baptized as babies, but I'm the only one who actually goes and practices.
Liesl, how long have you been doing this work with the children?
I guess in 2012 I started. And I did it for about 4 or 5 years. And then I had a baby. And I like to say they gave me a 4-year maternity leave because I took a break. And then I guess almost 2 years ago now, they asked me to come back. And at that time, I was actually working in the pediatric emergency room. So a lot was seen there. And but I'm a full-time here now. I just work here now. And I don't just work with the children now. I've moved up a little bit, so to say. But I basically, I'm Christian formation. That's what I do, so to say. And I love that because I get to do, what it's from cradle to grave. All the education in the church from cradle to grave.
So let me ask you this then. You said when you were in the first grade, you were cognizant of racism. Mm-hmm. Do you think the children that you have encountered, mm-hmm. do you think that they're cognizant of?
The ones today?
The ones today.
I have a 6-year-old, and no, I've raised her like I was raised, mm-hmm. so to say. When she was much younger, she was like, why is my friend brown? And my whole thing was, it's, I don't know, or I don't know how she said it, like, what about that brown person or something? And it's like, yes, but let's take out the color. They're people. And so that's how I'm raising her. And again, when she goes to the park, she always runs to the brown kids, just like me, We feel a comfort. I don't know.
So Ginny, do you feel comfortable with black people?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And what is the basis of your comfort?
I don't see any difference between us.
You just hit on it. So you don't see any difference?
No.
And you're saying you take out color.
Mm-hmm.
You say to your daughter to take out color. One of the challenges of us having this kind of conversation mm-hmm. is that people will say, no, but you have to acknowledge the color. And people will say, and yes, but there are differences. And it's because of the differences that we need to have this conversation, that these differences have been with us too long without us looking at them. And so the idea that here's a child and you will say, well, we want to be colorblind. There are people who are pushing back saying, well, we can't be colorblind in a society largely defined by color. However, we aspire to teach our children something beyond that. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what's so beautiful about what you've said, about what you're intentional about teaching your daughter mm-hmm. to go beyond this thing that we're so fixated on called color. Mm-hmm. Just go beyond it. You're free. You're allowed.
I mean, I want to teach her that we're more than color,
Yes.
So much more.
And same thing with you, Ginny. It's that there's a part of this where actually we're not different as we think. We come to this, all of us trying to figure it out. You didn't know at 16 that you'd be the grand Ginny that you are, but you set out on a path. And you made some good choices. I'm sure along the way you made some choices that weren't so good.
Oh, yeah. If you don't fail a little bit, you don't get
absolutely
too much wisdom going in your head.
That's right, but it's all enriched you. It's made you a better person in the end. And the fact that you can take all of that in and look at another person and with dignity, with absolute clarity, recognize that person as your equal. That's what's powerful. That's what each of us can do that we don't need permission for. Because a lot of us get stuck with the question that you asked earlier. Well, what can we do to change everything? That question is so big. It's why it was so difficult for you to answer. Yeah. That question is so big and is so charged with reasons not to get started that it almost becomes a disincentive for a lot of people.
Well, yes and no, and I know our time is limited,
No,
but
no.
I think in a political vein, because
Yes, you're a
you know,
political-
I'm a
yes.
political animal. And there are certain concrete things that can be done,
Yes,
and they can be done so easily.
yes.
And I could give you 3 or 4 off the top of my list that you would say, oh, yes, yes, yes. That would at least move the needle, so to speak, up this way. And they can be done, but they have not been done for a lot of different reasons. But there are some very concrete things that could be done.
Well, one for me is voter registration for the actual implementation
one,
of Amendment 4 for me as a formerly
Oh, yes.
incarcerated person. The recognition that it's now been stalled and that we're really in a tough fight
Yeah.
to push it through.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not a politician, but I recognize that there's going to have to be an alliance politically. People who are who care about the issues in your space politically.
Right. I think that the recent Supreme Court ruling kind of fell on your side. And it's a matter of having the political will to implement it.
Yeah.
So it's a lower level decision like this, but you really have, you're on the right road. The right road to be able to vote.
I absolutely know, and I know for me it's not enough just to vote. That's not enough. We need more than simply voting. We need to run for office. We need to field candidates. We need to have a political education campaign.
You and I could have a big discussion about that, big discussion.
So change
Yeah, right.
goes to a lot of levels
Right.
for us, but I always start, and really my heart is what can we do personally that's going to move the needle.
I wanted just to finish something I was saying that kind of helps with that change in the church and God is, like I said, my job basically, I'm very fortunate because I get to touch on everything from cradle to grave. I don't just work with the little children. So like earlier today when I got here, I was working on some baptism preparation for a little baby we're going to baptize Sunday. And that's, of course, really exciting. And, you know, I was thinking about this conversation as I'm getting that going and hoping, you know, this child is going to grow up in the church and learn to love everyone, you know, the same. And then just last week, part of my job is grave. I mark the spots if somebody's going to be interned into our bishop's garden, their ashes. And again, that's an honor to do. So everything in between, I, you know, just have to keep pushing that, you know, we are one, and, you know.
I just think that you're such a perfect person for teaching our children. I just think it's so important to have the right spirit of person around children,
Right.
particularly young children. And you just have such an amazing spirit, Liesl, for that. It's almost like you were born to it.
No, thank you. I, you know, lots of trial and error and just living and learning, you know, and sharing what I've learned. I think that's what we're here for.
Yes. Well, here's how I'd like to close today's session. Ginny, you are absolutely amazing. You're a leader. And I've heard your name several times, but we've never had an opportunity to
Which
meet.
I regret.
Yes, to meet directly. So this is wonderful that we have a chance to have this conversation. For me, a concrete outcome in the midst of all of this COVID-19 and civil unrest, I would like for you to become Liesl's mentor.
If she would like me to do
I would
that.
like you. I will have to find some time for that. But
Yes.
That would be great.
Because
be
I
great.
believe, absolutely, the experiences that you have had
Yeah.
are such that both of you will be immensely and deeply enriched. And so the concrete outcome, Ginny, might not have looked like what some people think it should, but one thing is for certain, It is in God's house. And therefore, let the church say, amen.
Yes, gosh, amen.
Thank you for this opportunity. It was great fun.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Khalil, so much. Thank you, thank you.
And I'll talk to you later. I'll get your email and talk to
Yes.
you.